Before his high-stakes missions, John Smith's life was defined by resilience and hardship in a small Texas town born Herman Monster to Bill and Frida, who loved vintage sitcoms. John faced constant teasing for his unusual name. Determined to distance himself from it, he endured schoolyard fights and stern home lectures. After high school, he sought purpose and enlisted in the Marines. 6 tough years, including deployments in harsh desert conditions, caught the attention of secret recruiters. These recruiters brought him to Sector Alpha, a covert organization where John took on the cover of an ordinary IT specialist. His unassuming appearance and friendly demeanor made him perfect for blending in unnoticed. The company, as insiders called it, valued his discreet nature and strategic mind. During this time, he met Houston, a lively and trusting woman, in a computer class arranged by the agency. They married, sharing simple joys, although her occasional naivety sometimes worried him. Returning home one evening, John parked in the garage, savoring the sight of Houston's car and the anticipation of their reunion. Entering the house, he was greeted by the aroma of her cooking. The warmth of home reminded him of his many roles, from soldier to covert operative to devoted husband. This evening promised a rare moment of peace. Houston, who worked as a legal secretary, knew John's job involved travel, but not its true nature. His cover as a globe-trotting IT troubleshooter allowed him to gather intelligence, though he didn't dwell on what the company did with it. Occasionally, he had to use his training, leaving him unsettled. That night, he walked into the familiar scent of lasagna, one of his favorite meals. The dining table was set with their wedding china, signaling a special evening. As he turned ahead upstairs, Houston appeared, stunning him in a short black dress that left little to the imagination. Her long dark hair framed her face, and high heels completed the look, promising a night that would help him forget the weight of his secret life. "How do you like it?" she asked, spinning to show off her dress. He noticed she wore only tiny underwear underneath and fought the urge to rip them off. "Wow," he said, "you look incredible." She laughed as he lifted her. "Easy, don't mess up my makeup." "What's the occasion?" he asked, eyeing the fancy china on the table. "For our guest." She said guest, but there are only 2 plates. "Where will the guest sit?" "At the head of the table," she replied. A sense of unease settled over Jan. "Where's my plate?" he asked. "We need to talk," Maria said, her voice tinged with nerves. "Talk about what?" Junk's eyes narrowed. "First, who is this guest?" Maria questioned. "My boss, Greg Wilson," she answered, glancing away. Junk's expression darkened. "You mean that guy who thinks he's God's gift to women?" "That's your perspective," Maria countered. "Hek, actually nice, and you'd like him if you got to know him." "I highly doubt that," John said, crossing his arms. "Keep going. You remember the position I mentioned applying for?" Maria asked. "Yes, some executive role," John replied. "Exactly, Greg. And the partners are considering me for it. It could mean more money for us, but I'd also have to travel to New York and Paris occasionally. Isn't that exciting?" "What's the catch?" he asked as she grew more nervous. "It means I may need to, provide extra services to Greg and the partners," she said hesitantly. "Extras as in sex?" he asked bluntly. "Yes," she said. "But it won't change anything for us. Greg says most men secretly want to see their wife with another man." "What else did he tell you?" John asked, trying to control his anger. "He told me to call you a deceived husband and not let you touch me without his approval." "Hyun's coming tonight to make your dream come true," Maria said, her voice wavering. Junk's jaw tightened. "We have a serious problem." "Houston problem? What do you mean?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "Have I ever given any reason to believe I'd want that?" Jayan demanded. "No, but Greg insists that most men don't know they want it until they experience it," she replied. "So let me get this straight. You invited Greg to my house to sit at my table, use our best china, and then sleep with you in our bed?" Junk's voice was ice. "Yes, that's the plan," she admitted. "Did he promise it'd be fun?" John pressed. "Yes, he said you'd eventually get used to it," she said softly. "Have you slept with him already?" John's stare was unflinching. "No," Maria replied, shaking her head. "He wants the first time to be in front of you." Jane took a deep breath, his eyes locked on hers. "Listen carefully. If you ever call me a deceived husband, I'll make sure no one ever finds your body." Maria's face blanched at his words, stunned. "Second, if Greg steps into my house and disrespects me, I'll handle him myself. And third, if you love me and want this marriage to work, call him now and quit your job. But he's already on his way, she whispered, fear flickering in her eyes. One last question, do you really want to stay married? Yes, she said. Then go upstairs and change, he ordered. I'll handle Greg, but he bigger than you and knows karate, she protested. You're just a programmer. I said I'll handle it. Go change now. She ran upstairs crying. John was left thinking about what to do. With his unfaithful wife, divorce was too risky, as it might reveal his real identity. The agency had methods for handling such issues, but turning her into an emotionless shell didn't sit right with him. He trusted she hadn't cheated yet, but the chance remained. The doorbell interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to a tall, muscular man. You must be Greg, John said. Yeah, Greg replied, pushing past him with a smirk. John hated that and restrained the urge to break his neck. Come in, John said, closing the door. Greg glanced at him and laughed. Sue, the deceived husband? No, John said calmly. I'm Houston's husband. Same thing, Greg scoffed. Give me a drink. Screw you. JN said, I'm not your servant. What did you just say? Greg snapped, surprised at the defiance. I said screw you. Are you deaf too? JN repeated. Greg's face darkened. I'll crush you. Do you know who I am? Yes, the guy who's been filling my wife's head with nonsense. Where is she? Greg demanded. Check coming, John said as Houston appeared in jeans and t-shirt. Why aren't you wearing the dress I bought? Greg asked angrily. I didn't feel like it, she said. Greg turned to John. Make her change. Why don't we discuss this in my office? John suggested. There's nothing to discuss. Greg said. Perfect, I'll just eliminate you here. Then John replied with a smile. Is that a threat? Greg sneered. No, it's a promise, John said coolly. Houston tried to interject, but JN signaled for her to stop. 5 minutes in my office. If you're still standing after, do whatever you want. Greg grinned arrogantly. I was a state karate champ. You really want this 5 minutes? John said. Fine, but you'll beg for mercy, Greg warned. John led the way to the basement and gestured for Houston to follow. She hesitated, shocked at her husband's demeanor, but complied. Once downstairs, John had Houston sit against the wall. Greg faced him, smirking. Well, now what? Greg asked. Waiting on you, John said. Greg mocked him, kneeling and putting his hands behind his back. Afraid to strike a man like this? Enough, Greg spat. You wanted this in seconds, John subdued. Greg, if anyone asks, you slipped on the soap, John whispered. Greg nodded weakly. I didn't hear you, John pressed. I understand, Greg managed. Good, remember, I know 1,000 ways to end you. Don't test me, John said. Now good night, Gracie. He knocked Greg out. John took out his phone. Clean up the second line and we'll need an inspector. Thanks, he said, ending the call. He turned to Houston, who sat in stunned silence. He dead? John said. No, but he'll have a bad headache. Who are you? She asked. Don't you know your own husband? John replied. I thought you were just a programmer, she whispered. John grinned. All programmers can do this. No, not all programmers, she said. I've seen Greg defeat larger opponents, break bricks and boards, but you took him down in seconds. He didn't stand a chance. No matter how strong you are, there's always someone stronger, Jan said. I was angry and motivated. Lucky I didn't eliminate him. What happens to us now? She asked. That depends, John replied. On what? She pressed. On your honesty. When the inspector arrives, John said. Inspector, what does that mean? She asked. It's a device my company uses to verify testimony, he explained. And if I fail? She asked nervously. Don't think about that, he said. Did you mean it when you said you'd eliminate me if I called you that? She asked, a tear rolling down her cheeks. Jan said, meeting her eyes. She shivered. And he added, my mother cheated on my father for years. He wanted a divorce but couldn't afford to lose everything, so he stayed for us. She humiliated him daily, calling him that word until it broke him. One day after my younger brother left for college, he threw away his ring, said goodbye at the bar, and drove off a cliff. Oh my God, I'm so sorry, John. I believed Greg's lies. Can you forgive me? We'll see after the check, John said as the doorbell rang. He opened the door to 3 men in white suits. 2 placed Greg on a stretcher and took him outside. The third man pulled out a tablet with a connected device. Miss, the inspector said, we'll be recording your testimony. This device measures your skin response and other indicators more accurately than a polygraph. Please answer truthfully. State Your full married name, Houston Smith. She replied, your age 26. The inspector cast a quick glance at John and gave a nod. John took a deep breath and asked, Houston, have you cheated on me? Since we got engaged? No, she answered, shaking her head. Have you had any sexual relations with anyone during that time? No, she repeated firmly. Has anyone touched you intimately? Junk's voice was steady but strained. No, Houston said. Junk's voice wavered as he continued. Were you planning to have sex with Greg tonight? Yes, she admitted, tears streaming down her face. Why? Junk's eyes searched hers for an explanation. Greg told me you'd want it, that you loved me enough to allow it. Houston sobbed. What else did he tell you? John pressed. He said that all married men dream of seeing their wives with someone else, she confessed. And you believed him? JK's tone carried disbelief. Yes, I'm so sorry, John. You travel so much, and I thought it would make you happy, she said, her voice breaking. Were you offered a job that required relationships with management? He asked, the tension in the room palpable. Yes, she whispered. Would it involve clients too? Junk's expression hardened. Probably, Houston admitted. Looking down, you think I'd approve of this? He asked, eyes narrowed. They said you'd resist at first, but eventually accept it, she replied. Did they imply there would be consequences if I didn't? Junk's tone darkened. Yes, it felt like a threat, Houston admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Do some women at your company have to go through this? John asked, eyes. But he'll have a bad headache. Who are you? She asked. Don't you know your own husband? John replied. I thought you were just a programmer, she whispered. John grinned. All programmers can do this? No, not all programmers, she said. I've seen Greg defeat larger opponents, break bricks and boards, but you took him down in seconds. He didn't stand a chance. No matter how strong you are, there's always someone stronger, Jan said. I was angry and motivated. Lucky I didn't eliminate him. What happens to us now? She asked. That depends, John replied. On what? She pressed. On your honesty. When the inspector arrives, John said. Inspector, what does that mean? She asked. It's a device my company uses to verify testimony, he explained. And if I fail? She asked nervously. Don't think about that, he said. Did you mean it when you said you'd eliminate me if I called you that? She asked, a tear rolling down her cheeks. Jan said, meeting her eyes. She shivered, and he added, my mother cheated on my father for years. He wanted a divorce but couldn't afford to lose everything, so he stayed for us. She humiliated him daily, calling him that word until it broke him. One day after my younger brother left for college, he threw away his ring, said goodbye at the bar, and drove off a cliff. Oh my God, I'm so sorry, John. I believed Greg's lies. Can you forgive me? We'll see after the check, John said as the doorbell rang. He opened the door to three men in white suits. Two placed Greg on a stretcher and took him outside. The third man pulled out a tablet with a connected device. Miss, the inspector said, we'll be recording your testimony. This device measures your skin response and other indicators more accurately than a polygraph. Please answer truthfully. State your full married name. Houston Smith. She replied. Your age 26. The inspector cast a quick glance at John and gave a nod. John took a deep breath and asked, Houston, have you cheated on me since we got engaged? No, she answered, shaking her head. Have you had any sexual relations with anyone during that time? No, she repeated firmly. Has anyone touched you intimately? Junk's voice was steady but strained. No, Houston said. Junk's voice wavered as he continued. Were you planning to have sex with Greg tonight? Yes, she admitted, tears streaming down her face. Why? Junk's eyes searched hers for an explanation. Greg told me you'd want it, that you loved me enough to allow it. Houston sobbed. What else did he tell you? John pressed. He said that all married men dream of seeing their wives with someone else, she confessed. And you believed him? JK's tone carried disbelief. Yes, I'm so sorry, John. You travel so much, and I thought it would make you happy, she said, her voice breaking. Were you offered a job that required relationships with management? He asked, the tension in the room palpable. Yes, she whispered. Would it involve clients too? Junk's expression hardened. Probably, Houston admitted. Looking down, you think I'd approve of this? He asked, eyes narrowed. They said you'd resist at first, but eventually accept it, she replied. Did they imply there would be consequences if I didn't? Junk's tone darkened. Yes, it felt like a threat, Houston admitted, her voice barely Above a whisper, do some women at your company have to go through this? John asked, eyes narrowing. Yes, she said, looking down. And do their partners support it? He continued, as far as I know, yes. She replied, wiping a tear. Have you talked to any of their partners directly? John pressed. No, it's just what some of the women told me. They said it brought in extra money over time. Houston explained. So others are getting paid for it? John asked, needing clarity. Yes, she confirmed. JJ's expression softened for a moment. Do you love me? Tears streamed down her face. Yes, more than anything, she said, voice trembling. Will you quit right now? Junk's tone was firm. She nodded, resolute. Would you sue if it came to that? He asked, searching her eyes. Yes, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right, Houston said, desperation in her voice. Are you just saying this because it's what I want to hear? JK's gaze was unwavering. No, John, I'm truly sorry. I believe their lies. Please trust me, she pleaded. Jan glanced at the inspector's tablet, then at him. The inspector nodded. Houston, stay here. I'll be back, John said, then walked upstairs with the inspector. So John asked in the living room. She's telling the truth, the inspector said. Alpha 1 wants to talk. He activated the app, and Regis Carlisle, Alpha 1, appeared on the screen, his sharp gaze fixed on John. John, I hear your return home was eventful, Regis said. Yes, sir, John replied. Could have been better. I've reviewed the results. What are your thoughts? Regis asked. My gut says to kick her out, John admitted. No one would blame you, Regis said, but there's more you should know. What do you mean? John asked. A divorce could expose your ties to Alpha. That wouldn't end well for either of you, Regis said. I understand, John acknowledged, aware of Alpha Sector's strict secrecy. We've been watching Omega, partly due to data you brought in, Regis continued, surprising John. That includes monitoring your wife while her judgment has been poor. She hasn't crossed any lines. Good to know, John said. What can you tell me about Omega? Not over this call, Regis said, but it's time to bring Houston in. Think you can handle that? I believe so, John said. Good, tell her only what's necessary. Bring her to my office at 7 a.m. sharp. She doesn't have clearance, John pointed out. She will by then technically she's already part of this, just unaware, Regis replied. John processed this. If true, Houston would have no choice but to cooperate. The alternatives were unsettling. Have dinner talk and bring her in tomorrow. Clear? Regis asked. Yes, boss, John said. By the way, letting Greg live was technically wrong. How's he doing? Regis asked. He's in a coma, Regis said. If he wakes up, he'll have amnesia. We'll handle any issues. John nodded. See you tomorrow, Regis said, ending the call. The inspector put away his device and left. See you, he said as he walked out. Jan went back downstairs. Houston sat in the chair, wiping her eyes. She looked up as he entered. I messed up, didn't I? She said. Jan replied, I'm so sorry, John. I believed Greg's lies and never meant to hurt you. I'll pack and go. You deserve better. She stood, but John stopped her. Stay, he said. I accept your apology, and I owe you one too. For what? She asked, surprised for being gone so much. My job is complicated. I understand, she said. No, you don't, John said. First, John Smith isn't my real name. Then who are you? She asked. Was the story about your dad true? Yes, he said. I was born Herman Monster in North Texas. Herman, she laughed. Yes, Jan said, smiling. It wasn't fun growing up with that name. After the Marines, I became John Smith. You were a Marine? She asked, surprised. There's a lot you don't know, he said. Leighton, eat, and I'll tell you more. Is the lasagna still warm? Yes, it's in the oven, she said. Perfect. Leighton, eat and talk, he said. Does this mean you forgive me? She asked. We'll see, he replied, offering his hand. She smiled, took it, and stood up. Houston listened quietly as John revealed the story he'd hidden for years. She barely touched her lasagna while he described his childhood as Herman Monster, his military service, and his recruitment by Sector Alpha, a covert government intelligence agency. He explained the name change and assured her it was all legal. You don't seem like a secret agent, she said softly. He laughed. Not everyone's a muscle-bound action star. The less noticeable you are, the better. Most of my job is boring, just gathering information. Did they teach you how to handle Greg? She asked. Yes, he said. I had martial arts training, and they built on that. I don't use it often, but I can defend myself. What level are you? She asked. Greg claimed to be a 5th degree black belt. I have a leather one, he joked, showing his belt. Very funny, she said, smiling before turning serious. What happens to us now? That's up to you, he said. We're meeting my boss tomorrow, HEK. Tougher than I am. What time? She asked. 7 a.m. So we need to leave by 5:30, he said. We should get to bed early, she suggested, taking his hand. John, I never meant to hurt you. Well, you did, he said. It'll take time to work through this. The only reason you're still here is because you didn't follow through. I need to know why you thought I'd want this. It took months, she said. The pressure really ramped up a few weeks ago. Greg and others showed me articles said all men secretly wanted it. They convinced me it was great. I resisted at first, but they wore me down. One woman even told me it saved her marriage. But you never asked their spouses or me, John said. It's hard to believe you fell for it. They told me not to tell you, that it was meant to be a surprise, she said. That's what tonight was supposed to be. Well, it backfired on Greg. Jan said. Yes, it did, she agreed quietly. You mentioned threats if I didn't comply. Jan said. What kind of threats? They said their security force would come after you. Siloviki, John asked. Yes, she said. Greg was in charge of them. They protect the company's leaders. They're ex-military, intimidating men. They won't be happy about Greg. John said. No, she has admitted. What did they say could happen to me? He asked. Accidents, car failures, attacks. They implied you could be harmed. I understand, John said. We'll make sure that doesn't happen. Promise me you'll be safe, she said. Everything will be fine, he assured her, hiding his own worry. Leighton, go to bed and handle this tomorrow, she said. Okay, he replied. I'll take care of the dishes. Houston cleared the table while John checked the house's security. He then went to his office, opened the tool safe, loaded a .45 pistol, and placed it in his bedside drawer. Afterward, he prepared for bed. John recalled Regis's words about reconnecting with Houston and intended to do just that. They lay together, made love, and she whispered, I love you. You're the only man for me. Of course, he replied, wanting to focus only on that moment. They embraced and fell asleep. In the morning, they woke early. John showered and shaved, while Houston made coffee, then switched places as he got dressed and double-checked the security system. He poured coffee and warmed rolls for the road. When Houston came down, they grabbed their things and left. Houston was surprised when they arrived at what seemed to be a junkyard. Is this your office? She asked. John smiled. Not everything is what it seems. He parked near a portable toilet. Hand me your phone, he said. After disabling tracking software, he handed it back. They were following you, he explained. They were tracking me, she asked, stunned. Yes, now let him go, he said. Regis was waiting. John led her into the portable toilet, which turned out to be an elevator. As it descended, Houston realized its purpose when the door opened. A garden camouflage asked for her ID. He scanned it and verified her identity with a retinal scan before allowing them through. Alpha 1 is expecting you, the guard said. JNLED. Houston down a hallway to a large marble foyer marked with Alpha Sector and the motto First Line of Defense. Another wall read, Our enemies do not sleep, and so do we. They stepped onto an emblem that lowered them into a room filled with monitors and personnel. A large man with an eye patch approached Regis Carlyle. He introduced himself. Call me Mr. Carlyle or Regis. You must be Houston. Yes, she replied, shaking his hand. Interesting name, Regis said. My parents named me after the city I was conceived in. She said, good thing it wasn't Todd Sack, Arkansas. He joked. She chuckled. True. Come into my office, he said. Inside, the glass walls darkened for privacy. Sorry, but I've never heard of Alpha Sector, Houston said. That's good, Regis replied. If you had, we'd have a security issue. Oh, she said. So what do you do? We gather global intel, analyze it, and act if needed. Your husband is one of our top operatives, Regis said, looking at John. By the way, Mr. Wilson is alive, but in a coma. Your handling of him was impressive. Thank you, Jan said, but kneeling was risky. Regis added, I thought it was the best option. John admitted. Regis nodded. Don't do that again, he said, turning to Houston. He asked, how long have you known about the leadership support team? About 2 or 3 months, she replied. What did they tell you initially? He asked. They said it was a prestigious team that supported executives and involved lots of travel, a promotion, and bonuses for both me and Jan. When did you learn about the sexual side? Regis asked, narrowing his eye. 2 weeks ago, When John was on his last mission, Houston answered. Regis nodded and brought up footage on the screen. Look at this, he said, showing a recording of Linda Wharton's private conference room. Houston gasped. How did you get this? She asked. Through the TV's built-in camera. Regis explained. You might have heard rumors about this online. I thought it was just a conspiracy theory. Houston said. Exactly what you should have thought, Regis replied, pressing play. The video showed Linda offering Houston coffee, adding something to it, and handing it to her. Pause, John said. Just pause the footage. Good observation. Linda likely sedated the coffee. We'll get back to that, he said, resuming the video. Linda told Houston the senior partners were excited for her to join the team and inquired about her husband's support. Houston confirmed John was supportive and loving. That's great, Linda said. Now there's an aspect of the job we haven't mentioned: providing personal services to managers and sometimes clients. This includes his ex. Houston, shocked, asked. You expect me to cheat on my husband? Not exactly, Linda said. We'll make sure he's on board and supportive. It's why he'll get bonuses too. Houston hesitated, expressing doubt. Linda reassured her, saying, by the time we talk to him, he'll be happy for you. It's said that all men secretly desire this, but don't admit it. John never mentioned that. Houston said he wouldn't. Linda replied, but deep down it's a common fantasy. I want to be part of the team, but not at the expense of my marriage. Houston said. Don't worry about John Weck. Handle him. Linda said. Just focus on your work and read the materials I send. Houston asked about other women's husbands, and Linda assured her they were happy, enjoying better relationships and checks. What should I tell Jane? Houston asked. Nothing for now. We'll manage it, Linda said. All right, Houston said. Good girl, Linda said. Go back to work, and we'll talk later. The video ended with Linda watching Houston leave, smiling smugly. Just paused the video and turned to Houston. How did you feel after that meeting? I was shocked and confused at first, but then I felt strange, she admitted. You felt excited, didn't you? Like what she said was enticing, Regis asked, blushing. Houston nodded. Yes, I even had to go to the restroom. That was likely due to the pill, Linda added. To your coffee? Reese did. You feel the same way after every conversation about the team? Yes, she said quietly. Regis nodded and showed another video, this time from Linda's office. Linda called a man named George. I spoke with Houston Smith, Linda said. Will she agree? He asked. On working on it. I sent her some stories to get her thinking, Linda replied. To turn her on, you mean? George said, laughing. Yes, Linda said. Her husband's away, right? George asked. Yes, I have time to prepare her, Linda said. By the time Hyun's back, check be ready. I'll handle Smith if he interferes, George said. Greg will work on him, and we'll use security if needed. Careful, Linda warned. If anything happens to him, we'll lose her. Then we'll speed up the plan. I have buyers in the Middle East waiting, George said. John and Houston exchanged horrified glances. 2 weeks. Linda, George said before ending the call. Who is George? John asked. George Black, the main partner, Houston said. John glared at Regis. You knew. Calm down, John. Regis said. I couldn't distract you from your mission. I trusted you to handle Greg, and you did. Your job is to adapt and overcome. Regis continued. There are more videos, but they repeat what you know. Each meeting involved a pill to manipulate Houston. They were turning her into a tool, and you were the main target. You heard George mention buyers, Regis said. We believe Omega is part of a human trafficking ring. Oh my God, Houston whispered. Regis displayed photos of 5 missing women. They all work for Omega. I knew some of them, Houston said. They said they were being transferred and then disappeared. Their husbands were told they were on business trips and kept getting paychecks. Eventually, the husbands reported them missing. We think they were trafficked. You were next. Houston, can they be saved? She asked. I doubt it, Regis said. I'd be surprised if they're alive. So what now? Jane asked. Houston can't go back. No, and I believe they're already after her, Regis said, showing a live feed from their living room. 4 large men and Linda were inside. How did they bypass our security? John asked. Good question, Regis said, eyeing Houston. I didn't give them the code, she said nervously. Weck, see what they do, Regis said, watching as Linda's phone rang. Houston's phone chimed seconds later. Regis gestured for her to answer. Houston answered her phone. Houston, where are you? Linda's voice demanded. John and I aren't home, she replied. What happened to Greg last night? Linda pressed, I think he slipped on soap or something. Houston said some soap. Linda said, Hoon in a coma. What really happened? Greg fought with John. John didn't react as you said he would. Houston replied, this is bad. The senior partners are angry. Come to the office now. Linda ordered. I'm done. Linda, I'm resigning. Houston said, that's not happening. You made commitments. Linda said, my commitment is to my husband. I'm not doing this. Goodbye, Houston said, ending the call. She looked at John, whom nodded in approval. They watched the video as Linda, furious, clicked on her phone and spoke to the men. Her phone's last location is a landfill off Highway 87. Go intercept them, but don't eliminate them. Bring them back alive. The four men nodded and left. Linda looked around, then left the room. The video ended. We have an hour before they arrive, Regis said, making a quick call. Operation Yard Dog. In 1 hour, he ordered. An hour later, 2 black SUVs arrived at the landfill. 4 men in suits got out and approached John's car, met by 2 men in overalls and caps. John, Houston, and Regis watched on screen. How can we help? One man, Bubba, asked with a thick southern accent. We're looking for the car owner, said a suited man, showing his tool. Bubba called out, hey, T-Bone, this guy's got a toy. T-Bone laughed, raising his rifle. That's a toy. This is real, he said, loading it. The suited man hesitated. We don't want trouble. We just need answers. One said, out of answers, T-Bone replied, but I got a beating out back free if you want it. Realizing they were outnumbered by armed men, one suit said, we're not getting Smith without a fight. The leader nodded. Litton go. They backed off, returned to their cars, and left, splitting directions. The pills they gave you for the last couple of weeks were part of this. We need to undo this damage. I'm certain that once we do, you'll recall much more than you realize. Will it hurt her? Jan asked. Regis shook his head. Not at all, he replied. We've made great strides in recent years. No one's performed a lobotomy in ages, he added with a smirk. John knew this was Regis's dark humor, but it startled Houston, who looked to John for reassurance. Regis chuckled. I'm just kidding, he said. You'll be fine. I'm also interested in figuring out what they dosed you with. He picked up the phone, spoke a few words softly, and hung up. What now? John asked. 2 gentlemen will be here shortly to take Houston to our mental health specialist. Regis said, you can go with her if you'd like. I'd like that. John said, will you stay with me? Houston asked him. Of course, he replied, taking her hand. A few minutes later, 2 men in white coats entered with a wheelchair. Houston sat down, and they left the room. They've been there too long, the lead enforcer told Linda as he watched the entrance. No movement had been seen for hours, and the 4 men were growing anxious. All right, she said, we know where they are. Head back to base. We'll catch up with them later. The call ended, and the SUVs turned around. Linda put the phone down and looked at George. They couldn't get the Smiths back? George asked. Linda nodded. Know what the update on Greg? She inquired. George shook his head. Not great, he said. His injury are worse than expected, and he might not make it through the night. What's next? She asked. Should we take them and bring them here? No, George replied. Weck moved them to the beach house. How do we get them there? She asked. I'll leave that to you, George said. Houston mentioned she wanted to resign. Let her do that. Make sure it won't cause any issues. She's gullible enough to trust you. Her husband will probably want to come along. Let him get security ready to grab them both. I need to find out how much he knows about our operation. Why does this matter so much? She asked. I thought he was just an insurance company programmer. George shook his head. That's not all he is. I just don't know how much more he knows. So you're using Houston as bait, she clarified. He'll spill everything once he realizes how serious this is. He'll do anything to save her. I hope you're right, she said. George smiled. Trust me, I am. Just make sure the house is set up, he said. You tried to make him complicit willingly. Now we'll make it unavoidable. Once we're done, we'll hand him off and he'll die with a little assistance from us. She smiled at the idea and left the office. What they didn't know was that their conversation had just been recorded and sent to Alpha servers. John sat in the waiting room while his wife underwent the hypnotherapy Regis had mentioned, meant to unlock her memories. He had been waiting for over an hour when Regis entered. Do you have a moment? Regis asked. John looked up. Of course, he said. Any idea how much longer it will take? At least 2 more hours, Regis replied. John nodded and stood up. Regis let him out, and John Followed, they soon found themselves in Regis's smoking room, a well-ventilated space with armchairs facing an artificial fireplace. Reed just sat down and gestured for John to join him. He opened a small case and offered John one of his fancy-flavored mini cigars. "Thanks," John said, and Reed just lit his cigar. I still can't believe they let you smoke in here," John remarked, enjoying the sweet aroma. "Well, this place is built to withstand a direct nuclear hit. I think a few cigars won't hurt," Regis said with a shrug. John chuckled as Regis handed him a folder. John opened it and skimmed through the medical report, which didn't make much sense to him. "What is this?" he asked. "It's the report from your wife's blood tests," Regis said. "Look at the two marked areas. One indicates a restraint pill, and the other is a compound I haven't seen in a long time." "What's that?" John repeated, frowning. "In small doses it makes someone highly susceptible to suggestion," Regis explained. "Paired with the restraint pill, I'm guessing Houston was on edge. They could have suggested she do anything, and she likely would have complied. Honestly, it's surprising she managed to hold on this long anyway. There's a federal agency monitoring this substance, and they've sent one of their top agents. He'll be here this afternoon, I see," John said, taking a puff of his cigar. "Anything else?" "Yes," Regis said. "Omega is planning to capture you both at their first opportunity." "We already knew that," John replied. "This time it's permanent," Regis added. "From the footage we received, they plan to sell you to a Middle Eastern buyer and stage your deaths." "What's the plan?" John asked. "We're not going to let that happen," Regis said. "We have people watching them, and we'll know when and where they'll move. I have a conference call to discuss this. Can I join?" Jane asked. "Sorry, son, it's above your clearance," Regis said. "Your main job is to stay close to your wife." John nodded. They smoked their cigars in silence for a few minutes before John spoke again. "Have you ever been married, Regis?" he asked. Regis glanced at him. "Yes. A long time ago," he said, the pain evident in his voice. "What happened? If you don't mind sharing?" John asked. "The usual story," Regis said. "Too much time at work, stress from fighting enemies, and keeping secrets from loved ones. You know how it is." John nodded. "Yes, I do. It was too much for her." Race said. "One day I came home to find she had left. She left a note saying she'd found someone else, someone who was home and open with her. I also found divorce papers. This was 15 years ago. I'm sorry," Jan said. "Do you have kids?" Regis said. "Two beautiful girls. Their mother took them, and now they call another man dad. I haven't spoken to them in years. They've probably forgotten me. But your situation might be different." "I hope so," Jane said. Reed just nodded. "Houston is a good woman," he said. "Yes, she's naive at times, but she's smarter and stronger than you think, and she really loves you. God knows why." They both smiled. "You need to be there for her, Jane." "I know," John said, "and I will." "All right," Regis said, standing up. "I need to make a call. Go to Houston, and I'll message you when I'm ready." "Got it," John said. He finished his cigar after Art just left and went to check on Houston's progress. When he arrived, he was informed that she was almost done and would be out soon. John sat and turned on the TV, though his thoughts were elsewhere. About an hour later, the door opened and Houston walked out. She smiled when she saw him, and he noticed something different about her, though he couldn't place it. "How do you feel?" he asked. "I'm okay," she said, smiling. John turned to the technician who had treated her. "Is she free to go?" he asked. The technician nodded. "Yes, she can go. We're preparing the report for Alpha 1. "Thanks," John said, turning to Houston. "I don't know about you, but I'm starving. Want to grab something at the cafeteria?" "Definitely," she said. They went to the cafeteria and ordered bacon burgers with fries. "You seem different," Jane said as they sat down. "Are you sure you're okay?" "I feel better than I have in ages," she replied. "My head feels clearer." "Did you remember a lot?" he asked. "Oh yes," she said, her eyes bright. "I can't believe how close I came to betraying you. Can you ever forgive me?" "I think so," he said, opening the folder with the report. "What's that?" she asked. "Your blood test report," he said. "They found traces of a restraint pill and something meant to make you suggestible." "Reed just said that with those pills you must have felt like you were losing your mind." "Yeah," she nodded, eyes moist. "It was hell. Each day was a struggle." "And those stories Linda sent you?" he asked. "Did you read them?" She nodded. "Do you want to guess what they were about? Or should I tell you?" "You can tell me," he said. "They were all the same. Husbands were weak, wives were promiscuous, and lovers were cruel. Husbands were humiliated, forced to watch their wives with other men, and then clean up after them. Did those stories excite you? John asked. I'm embarrassed to say, but yes, they did, she admitted. Between those stories and what Linda, Greg, and the others said, I was constantly on edge. Now I understand I was sedated and manipulated, Regis said. It was amazing you lasted as long as you did, Jan said. It wasn't easy, John, she said. It felt like a battle between two parts of myself. Good Houston was saying, no, don't betray your husband, it's wrong. While bad Houston whispered, come on, let Greg have his way, Johan will never find out. I'm glad you listened to good Houston, James said, except for that last day. Would you really have gone through with it if I hadn't stopped him? Asked. Probably, she admitted. No, that's not true. Yes, I would have, and I'm so ashamed of it. John nodded. You reminded me of who I really. And she added with a smile, will you ever forgive me? I think I can, considering everything, he said. Just don't let it happen again, I promise, she said. I know I've been naive, but now I see everything more clearly. I have one condition, John said, smiling. What is it? She asked. You're going to show me how you use that toy one day, he said. Seriously, she said with a grin. You want to see me do that? Of course, he said. Why not? Maybe if you behave, I'll let you watch, she teased. You're so mischievous, Jan said, but agreed. John's phone buzzed, and he checked it. It was a message from Regis. Regis wants to see us, he told Houston. Are you done with lunch? She stood up. Yes, I'm finished, she said, eating the last of her fries. John got up, and they walked to Regis's office. As they entered, they saw a man of average height in a dark blue jacket standing there. John, Houston, Regis said. This is Oscar Warren from the Homefront Security Task Force. Oscar, meet Jan and Houston Smith. They shook hands, and Regis gestured for them to sit. Front Security Task Force, Jane, and asked, what is that? I've never heard of it. Most haven't heard of you either, Oscar said. We're a public-private task force dealing with situations similar to what you're facing. Now he laid out photos of 4 women on the desk. Mrs. Smith, have you seen any of these women before? Oscar asked. Houston examined the photos and pointed to one. This one, she said. Are you sure? Oscar confirmed. Yes, she said. It was a couple of years ago, but I remember her talking to George and Linda. So George Black, the senior partner, and Linda Wharton, head of the executive support group. Oscar clarified. Houston nodded. Yes. Do you know what they talked about? He asked. No, not at all, she said. I assumed she was a client or potential client. Have you heard of EMS, or the Mutual Marriage Assistance Society? Oscar asked. Houston thought for a moment. Yes, I've seen that term in documents that passed my desk, but I didn't think much of it. The woman you identified was Pat Witherspoon, Oscar said. Does that name mean anything to you? No, it doesn't, she said. Oscar nodded. Who is Pat Witherspoon? Regis asked. She was the top EMS agent, Oscar explained. She died about 1.5 years ago while in custody. And what is EMS? Regis asked. It started as a group punishing unfaithful husbands, Oscar said, but it evolved into something else. What worries me is what Witherspoon did within Almagons was advancing a dominant political agenda. What does that have to do with a law firm involved in human trafficking? Regis asked. Good question, Oscar said. What do you know about the house on the coast? He asked. Houston, the company has a place there, she said, but it's more than a house. It's a complex with a pier and a helipad. I've never been, but I heard it's walled with security gates. Top executives go there to meet clients or unwind. That's where George and Linda plan to take you, Regis said. Houston's expression darkened as she processed the information. Her eyes suddenly widened. What is it? Regis asked. I remember co-worker mentioning a party she attended there, Houston said. She described it as wild with illegal substances and all sorts of things. That's where they intended to sell you to a buyer, Reese said. We need to alert the White House, Oscar said. Regis nodded and turned to Jan. Why don't you step outside with Houston for a moment, he said. John stood and gestured for Houston to follow. Once outside, Houston spoke. What did Reese mean? She asked him. Linda and George were going to make you a Z's slave, he said, and from what I've heard they plan to eliminate me too. Oh my God, Houston said. What will they do now? I don't know, he said. We'll have to wait. They didn't wait long. A few minutes later, the door opened, and Regis called them back in. Once they were seated, Regis Pressed a button on his phone. We located the coastal complex Regis said you were. Right, it's walled and has a security gate. There's activity there. He pressed another button, and a video feed of the complex appeared on the screen. How are things on site? He asked into the phone. We've got everything covered, said a voice. There are 6 people in the main building. 2 arrived by helicopter a few minutes ago. 4 seem to be security guards. 1 is a woman and the other an older man. It's probably George and Linda. Houston said. Understood, Regis said. Await further orders. He pressed another button, and a different voice responded. Eagle 1, said a man. Eagle 1, this is Alpha 1, Regis said. Do you have eyes on the target? Affirmative, Alpha 1, the man replied. Armed? Regis asked. Fully armed, ready for action, the man confirmed. Regis grasped the significance. An agency drone equipped with 4 Hellfire missiles. Hold for my command, Regis said. Target the helicopter and demolish the main building. Understood, the operator confirmed. Houston's phone rang, and she saw Linda on the screen. She mouthed the name silently before answering. Hi, Linda. Houston said. What can I do for you? Houston, I think there was a misunderstanding earlier. I want to make it right. Linda said. Can you and John come to the coastal house? When Houston asked